Skyward Sword has been released at this point in time for about half a year. It has since been awarded with much positive praise and has won and or been nominated for many awards. However, does the game live up to such praise? I am the Namekian, and that is what I will be answering as we take a look at The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword. Now, I am going to forego the normal route of doing a history section of the series and instead look at the series in a different manner. I believe that it is far more important to look at the predecessors to a series to judge a game than it is to look at the game as a standalone. If there isn't any positive progression in the series, then the game is merely riding the coattails of the previous titles. So before we go Skywards, let's set the foundation first by looking at some of the games in the series. Before we start, I ask that you please hear me out before the torches and pitchforks. I am a fan of the series. Even the worst games are good games. I just don't think a title alone should warrant any special treatment. The Zelda series has been around for 25 plus years now and has spawned over 15 titles in that time period. Don't worry, I won't be going over all of them. Mario may have been the savior of the gaming industry, but it is Zelda that made sure that it wasn't going to go away again. Its characters, music, and concepts have been duplicated many times over, and we have it to thank for most modern-day adventure titles. It all started in 1986 with The Legend of Zelda for the NES. This game was probably one, if not the first, truly open-world game to hit a console. There really wasn't anything in terms of story, at least in-game, and it was far from the typical linear progression most games had at that time. If you wanted to do dungeon number 2 before dungeon number 1, then so be it. There were some exceptions, but you were free to go and do whatever you wanted when you wanted to do it. Even a lot of the bosses could be taken down in multiple ways. Also, just because you chose the easier path doesn't mean that the game is a cakewalk either. All of which probably helped with its success, which was huge. About 1 year later, Nintendo released Zelda 2: The Adventures of Link. This was a slight change of formula from the previous game. It was less open world and focused primarily on action instead of adventuring. While there were a few dungeons that you could do out of order, example being the swamp-esque dungeon, the vast majority of them were required to complete before you could advance in the game. Or should I say, the items in the dungeons are needed for progression, not the completion of the area itself. There was still plenty of secrets to be found, a very nice and somewhat missed leveling system, and there was an interesting magic system in replacement of actual combat items. The dungeons themselves were also slightly different as well. There wasn't a map or a compass to follow, and you weren't guaranteed success without having the necessary spell before entering. The difficulty level was also very high in this game. Most of the boss battles required a true mastery of the controls, and health rejuvenation was a very rare commodity, making it difficult to just get to the boss. Zelda 2 didn't do as well in terms of the critics' reception as did the original. However, there is something that I would like you to do, especially for those gamers out there that haven't played these games in a long time, or for those that have played both several times in recent years, which is basically they ask the question, which is more memorable to you? The first screen of the original game and getting the sword for the first time is iconic because it is generally used whenever someone references the game. But ignoring that, what in the two games brings that nostalgic smile and feeling? For me, the dungeons, or should I say their look, in the first game is really the only thing that is overly memorable. They are both great games, don't get me wrong. Just the first one doesn't have a very good draw for me. The second one almost defines the NES era, though. The villages, going into the houses, the continue screen with Ganon's laughter, and being bounced into a pit from a hit are scenes that always remind me of the old days and makes me want to play the game again. I am also curious, from fans and non-fans alike, which of the two NES games have you replayed the most? In 1991, A Link to the Past was released for the SNES, and this was a series game changer big time. For the first time in the series, the game was a narrative story, probably due to the fan backlash, though I think it was more critic backlash instead. The rest of the game went back to its roots, sort of. This really is not an open world game like the original, but not as restrictive as the second game either. While you are given a certain amount of freedom in the game, it only really opens up when you get certain items. And even then, you can only really get the items in the order of the story from the dungeons. The dungeons are linear in the order that you can do them in. This all makes the game feel rather linear. This change was okay in terms of the series. It was basically the same game as the original, but gave it more purpose, making it feel more epic. Most bosses can still be defeated in multiple ways, with items just making it easier to do so. The dungeons had plenty of puzzle elements added to it, and it had the clever concept of Light World and Dark World, making the game big without making the world big. With good reason, the game was a big success, and most fans and critics alike saying that it is the best 2D Zelda game. The first two games can be forgivable if you haven't played them, but this one should be played by any fan of adventure games. Roughly 2 years later, the Game Boy was given the often forgotten about, and my personal favorite in the series, Link's Awakening. The game was a natural progression for the series. It borrowed heavily from the look and feel of Link to the Past, but it felt like its own game. You aren't in Hyrule. Zelda and the Triforce aren't in the game either. You fight Ganon, sort of, but he isn't the enemy in the game. Your task is to find musical instruments, being the first to add a musical element to the series, and return home. Yeah, the ending and concept is a bit of a cop-out, but it was something other than go save the princess. The game also introduced a lot of future series staples, such as the owl, focus on music-related themes, and its character, Marin, was the inspiration for Marin. The dungeons and puzzles were interesting, what with the introduction of the feathered jumping mechanic, and the world felt large despite the limitations of the system. The game, like its NES predecessor, isn't really open world. However, this is made slightly less an issue due to the layout of everything. It isn't that big of a deal to get from place to place in the game, and the Flying Rooster helps in this regard as well. Ocarina of Time, a huge series game changer, was released in 1998 for the N64. This is where I'm probably going to make some people mad, but please hear me out first. This is a good game, not the worst in the series, and I can understand and respect why so many people like it. However, in my opinion, this is not as good as a game as everyone makes it out to be. The story is nothing new. Ganon takes Zelda, and you have to go rescue her. Again, sorry for any spoilers. I know what the majority of you are thinking out there. Mario has had the same story since the start. Well, true, but Mario isn't really telling a story. And I would argue that for the most part, the game elements are different in each of the Mario games. Tell me, outside of it being in 3D, how much of the game is different than Link to the Past? Yes, it has a time element, but that is just a replacement for the light and dark world. The items you get really aren't that different from what you get in this SNES game. I also found that the puzzles are mostly just recycled from the previous games as well. If you had played the past games, then you will have a pretty good understanding on what to do when you enter the room. The game is also very, very linear. Hyrule Field is really the only thing that makes the world feel large, but that, and Epona for that matter, are totally unnecessary to the game. You cannot progress into new areas until the story progression gets to the point, and it feels like you have less freedom when it comes to the boss battles as well. I know I am knocking it pretty hard. Despite all that I have said, though, I did find the graphics, music, dungeons, and boss battles to have all been well done. The end fight against Ganon was great, something that just seems to get better and better in the series. It just felt like the original formula was gone and that I had already done this before. If you are new to the series, then I can see where the high praise can come from. I just cannot see this as anything truly new for the series. most of the games that followed Ocarina had a similar flow to it. I can't really blame Nintendo for the lack of innovation in the series. Whenever they even remotely change the formula, they get panned by critics pretty heavily. Oddly enough, I find that a good number of people who have played at least the console games will have the shunned games like Majora's Mask and Wind Waker higher on their list than Ocarina and Twilight Princess. And while Link to the Past is generally on the top of the list when it comes to the 2D games, Zelda 2 is hardly ever that far down on the list. Last quick mention are the CDI games. I do not own a CDI, hence why no gameplay footage, and I haven't really played these games in years. However, I think those games get something of an unfair criticism. The animation is horrible, and the voice acting should be perfect proof that text is preferred in the series. With that aside, the biggest complaint that I always hear about the game comes from the problems with the system itself, mainly the controls. I admit that the controls are horrible, however, the games themselves are actually rather good. I think if Nintendo fixed the control placement and released the games on the Virtual Console or something, a lot of the bad taste would go away and the games would actually be somewhat fun. Now, with that out of the way and established, please join me in part 2, where we will take a look at Skyward Sword itself. Thanks for watching, and God bless.